Hello, welcome to another book report. As usual, another good book. Home, Land, Security, Deradicalization, and the Journey Back from Extremism by Carla Power. Not quite what I was expecting, but a fascinating read if you're if you're if you're interested in thinking about and exploring extremism and terrorism and what drives people to commit atrocious acts on innocent people. It is fascinating, although I was a tad disappointed that she didn't even mention state-sponsored terrorism. It's completely focused on, but I guess that was her focus. I don't know, based on the title and the little bit I read before I got it from the library. I thought it would be a little bit more general about terrorism, but definitely specific to individual terrorists. And it's a complex topic. There's a lot to it, right? But excellent exploration. It was also nice. It had some autobiographical aspects to it. So she goes right in there and says, talks about her journey exploring this topic as well, and actually meeting people who have committed acts of violence for ideological reasons, basically non-state terrorism, right? And her personal journey, in fact, she talks about one person that she, at a conference, that she just could not face and talk to because their act of violence was just too horrendous. And their victims were just too young, children. He killed children, and it was just too much. She just couldn't treat him like a human being, even though she tried. Anyway, the autobiographical aspect was interesting, but it's not an autobiography by any stretch. So let's see here. I think I can skip 48. Oh, the push-pull factors. Actually, I do want to read that. Which speaks to the complexity of it. So, to get a glimpse of just how manifold the drivers toward militancy can be, one need only look at the Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism issued by the United Nations in 2016, which attempted to list them. People could be susceptible to push factors, including lack of socioeconomic opportunities, marginalization and discrimination, poor governance, violations of human rights and the rule of law, prolonged and unresolved conflicts, and radicalization in prisons. They could also be susceptible to pull factors, including individual backgrounds and motivations, collective grievances and victimizations stemming from domination, oppression, subjugation, or foreign intervention, distortion and misuse of beliefs, political ideologies, and ethnic and cultural differences, and leadership and social networks. On reading it, I thought there were nearly as many reasons people were drawn to jihad as there were jihadists. Oh, that was another thing. The beginning of the book was completely focused on Muslim extremism, although she does expand into white supremacist and right-wing extremism as well. She doesn't touch on left-wing extremism at all, but there's less examples of that today, and hopefully won't be in the near future. Anyway, also another thing, she really attempts to humanize the journey into extremism, which I think is smart. People are complex, and if I hadn't in a different environment, I could see I could even see myself, and that's a big part of the book, that everyone has an extremist in them given the right environment and circumstances. And I think there is some truth to that. In very extreme situations, we could all commit extreme acts. I think there's some truth to that. Anyway, basically what I was trying to say there was that when I was young, a lot of my desire for justice and rapid change were directed in fairly positive ways for the most part, and distinctly nonviolent. But that didn't have to be the case if I, was in different environments and had different influences and different leaders shaping me. Instead of Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and the like, it could have been, I don't know, Stalin or whatever. I don't know. I hadn't thought too deeply on it. But anyway, just that young men with a lot of testosterone and a thirst for justice could be led down the wrong path due to their environment, bad leadership, a whole host of issues or possibilities, right? Let's see. Oh, yeah. This was an interesting little aside, I thought. So she shares that she read something from the Israeli author Amos Oz, wrote about growing up in Jerusalem in the 1940s, in the final years of the British mandate over Palestine. He'd been a little Zionist nationalist fanatic, self-righteous, enthusiastic, and brainwashed. He wrote, hurling stones and shouting "British go home" at patrolling army cars. But then he befriended a British policeman, an act that led the other children to label Oz a traitor. Much later, this is a quote here, much later I learned to take comfort in the thought that, for fanatics, a traitor is anyone who dared to change, close quote. He wrote, quote, fanatics of all kinds in all places at all times loathe and fear change, suspecting that it is nothing less than a betrayal resulting from dark base motives, close quote. So, again, this is a complicated topic. I thought that was fascinating that I disagree that all fanatics loathe change. Some fanatics want change. In fact, some of the most horrific things ever done were in the name of utopian visions by Stalin or Mao, that kind of thing. These, that this future utopia is worth millions of people dying, because the future good is so good that anyway, fanaticism definitely it could be wanting change, not fear of change. Although I think particularly white supremacists in the United States obviously fear change. Many extremist groups do fear change. That is so. Again, some truth, complicated topic, but I thought that was an interesting perspective from a former Zionist extremist. Political impotence. I thought that was a thing. So here he talks about how many Western. This is somebody she spent some time in and interviewed and spent time with, and I don't see his name. Abdul. Oh no. Anyway, doesn't matter. This person works with former extremists, trying to bring them back into society, and de-radicalizing them, and saying that a lot of the policies of Western countries, particularly Britain and the United States, are counterproductive in that they're trying to repress radical thought and ideas, and really the best really you should be encouraging debate, and talking about many legitimate problems that people who are radicalized have. It's not that all of their complaints are invalid. It's just that they express them in a violent way that we would not like. Particularly when innocents are harmed, of course, right? So anyway, the key concept here was, I didn't quite get that part, but anyway, notes that fostering a climate for new solutions, by fostering a climate for new solutions and encouraging debate and exploration of all kinds of ideas instead of repressing certain ideas as quote unquote bad. Anyway, allowing a free flow of debate produces fresh and progressive ideas about a society bubbling up from communities themselves. By fostering a climate for new solutions, a society staunches the need for terrorism, which Kundani notes, quote, is not the product of radical politics, but a symptom of political impotence. I really liked that phrase, that and again, there's always exceptions, but in many cases, terrorism is the last resort of people who have no political, no way to express themselves politically, so they resort to violence. Right? There's either corruption or lack of democracy or whatever the case may be. Anyway, I like that quote. Not a product of radical politics, but a symptom of political impotence. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So now 146. Oh, yeah, and here again, and she contradicts herself. There's a lot of, it's complicated. Anything you can say about terrorism, there's always exceptions. And this section, I really like that, that terrorists really are, anybody in the right conditions could become an extremist or a terrorist. So his claim of normalcy for terrorists is a political act in itself, challenging the way many of us cordon off the terrorists among us. Statistically speaking, Hood is right. Studies of militants' psychological backgrounds suggest that they are no more affiliated with mental illness than anyone else, with mental illness than anyone else. Terrorism would be a trivial problem if only those with some kind of psychopathology could be terrorists, observes the social psychologist Clark McCauley. Quote, rather, we have to face the fact that normal people can be terrorists, that we ourselves are capable of terrorist acts under some circumstances, close quote. So I think that's important. Humanize, nobody is their worst act. Everybody's complicated. But that said, again, the author herself, there were some people that were just, their acts were just so horrific she couldn't face them as a human being. So, it's complicated. All right, 152. Oh, Wahhabism. Yeah, I thought this was worth reading. Okay, so in the past few decades, as Sanam Naragi Anderlini, director of the London School of Economics Center for Women, Peace and Security, points out, two global trends have boosted the appeal of violent extremism. The first is the well-documented export of hardline Wahhabi ideology from Saudi Arabia to Muslims around the world. The second trend, boosting not only jihadist groups but white supremacist ones, is what she calls, quote, rampant extreme capitalism, close quote. When governments cut back on public services, whether through austerity drives, an ideological commitment to small government, or service on their international debts, vulnerable communities face a vacuum that extremists can easily exploit. There are some fundamental structural factors that have arisen because of neoliberalism and extreme militarization, and unless we begin to deal with them, these movements will continue to grow because they are actually responding to people's needs, close quote. So again, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and as always, there's our exceptions. Many extremists, including suicide, people who killed themselves during the attack, actually are not, are middle class. They're well off. They're college educated even. So there's always exceptions, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. So let's see here. Yeah, we covered that. And then 33. Oh, the macro forces. So yeah, and then in addition to many countries eliminating or greatly reducing the safety floor and social programs, other macro factors. First paragraph, yeah. Oh, right, foreign policy. So basically, she was talking to an Indonesian Al-Qaeda admirer and aspiring politician, someone who started down the path but pulled back before he actually committed any physical violence. How he'd stop recruitment to military groups. Easy, he said, without skipping a beat. The United States and Italy should stop invading other countries. Now, obviously, that's a little simplistic, but there's a lot of truth to it. And, Robert Poppy, a political scientist at the University of Chicago, did a study, and statistically, he studied patterns among suicide bombers around the world between 1980 and 2003. He found that nearly all shared one characteristic, and it wasn't a Muslim background. Rather, a full 95% of them were under some sort of foreign occupation. So basically, now again, that number itself is a little simplistic, but it's pretty compelling. Basically, between 1980 and 2003, 95% of all suicide bombers were under foreign occupation. That's pretty compelling. All right, so, and the last section, no rehab, no safety floor. So, right, so the other aspect of not having a safety floor and social programs is that it's much harder that the people who are radicalized and then sort of pull back from it, it's easy for them to get back into the radicalization if they can't get a decent job, or they can't get some education, or they can't don't have any support at all. So those social supports can be very important, particularly for working class or poor people who have been exposed to or are trying to come back from extremist groups and beliefs. And I thought this was a great place to end, that everybody's complicated. I'm going to go ahead and read both paragraphs because I like this. Okay, so relying on traditional identity politics doesn't work, he believes. This is another person in Belgium, I believe, working for the government, actually, government-sponsored de-radicalization programs. And he says, traditional identity politics doesn't work, he believes, because labeling people is actually organized segregation. Instead, viewing radicalization as stemming from isolation, he set out to strengthen Michelin's, a town in Belgium, Michelin's social connective tissue. In a hyper-diverse city, citizens needed to be allowed to thrive as multifaceted beings rather than simply be defined as Muslim or by their countries of origin. To think of people in terms of a single identity makes a caricature of each of us. He says, if I reduce you to an American and I am only a European, then you become Donald Trump in my eyes. Worse, this kind of reductionism allows people to get control over who you are. Political opportunists prey on single-faceted identities, and all too soon, you've got leaders who are defining what we have to do to be a good American, or a good Muslim, or a good Belgian. Then you lose your freedom. To deny the multitudes in each person makes for a brittle civic life. Politicians and groups promoting single-faceted identities would miss, for example, that Mayor Summers is simultaneously a citizen of Mechelen, Flemish, Belgian, European, a father, a liberal, someone who likes to read books, and someone who doesn't like to watch soccer, he says. Each of these identities serves as a way for him to connect with his fellow citizens. All these identities allow me to have something to bridge to other people, to have something in common with them. And if you have 3 or 4 things in common, then the 2 or 3 things that are different are not a threat. They get interesting, and we can talk about them because we have enough in common. His exuberant concept of a self of many parts and his faith in it, that it can be put to use for a vigorous, healthy democracy, reminds me of the famous lines from an earlier, equally passionate champion of pluralism. "Do I contradict myself?" wrote Walt Whitman. "Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." Really interesting book, very thought-provoking, explores the topic in a really rich way, I believe. So definitely worth reading if you're interested in radicalization and de-radicalization and how, we need to treat, obviously some crimes are so horrific, but in general, most people who are exposed to radicalization can still live full, rich lives. There's several examples in this book, and we need to treat them like people and help them, lead full, productive lives. And some of them are actually actively preventing younger people from becoming radicalized. So, anyway, if it's a topic you're interested in, I really recommend it. I think she was a really thoughtful, interesting writer. Like I said, the autobiographical parts were interesting as well. So, anyway, Homeland Security by Carla Power. Until next time, happy reading.